Okay, just had to pull it up. All right, we are in Revelation 8, 1 through 13. Listen to this 8th chapter. When the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel with a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given a great quantity of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar that is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets made ready to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood. And they were hurled to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light was darkened. And a third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, at the blasts of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow." Normally, we'd say thanks be to God in response to our scripture passages. It might be appropriate that we respond instead by saying, "Lord, have mercy." So let me say, this is the written word of the Lord, and we respond by saying, "Lord, have mercy." That seems an appropriate response to a text like this. But boy, here is where a lot of people will close the book. You know, if they might get through chapter 6. If they get through chapter 6 and they come to chapter 8, then it's like, whoa, okay. Now it's kind of getting scary, right? So, I mean, what are our thoughts? Reading through this the first time tonight, what stands out? What is significant? What's happening in this passage that needs to be noted?
There's fire.
There's this fire, right? Yeah. Which has multiple implications. Fire is consuming. It's destructive, but it's purifying. Yeah, what else? What stood out to you? What, when you read this, were you like, whoa, hello, that's interesting? A third. Yeah. We'll talk about that. We're going to look at why that specific number. I've said before, to read Revelation, you have to be able to do math. You have to know numbers in order to read Revelation. The numbers are important. That percentage is significant. So, Betty, we're going to talk about that. Anything else that stands out that catches your attention?
Well, verse 2 was describing 7 angels.
Yes.
Why 7?
Why 7? Yeah. Does anybody still have their cheat sheet? The Revelation symbol chart? Yeah. The numbers in chapter 8 are on that. So 1/3 is on there, 7 is on there that represent different things, and 7 is fullness. 7 is completion. So 7 angels and 7 trumpets. This would represent all of the angelic presence.
Well, it all seems to be happening to God's creation.
Yeah.
All these horrific things.
A lot of it's happening to creation. Yes, to nature. Yeah.
Well, another thing is that the eagle is crying out a warning, but not because of what's already been opened, but because of what will be opened.
Because of the next 3. The next 3 trumpets that are coming. The eagle is saying, giving warning, heed these words. Yes. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, and this can be a pretty scary chapter, but I'm wanting it to take some of the fear away from it. I really think this chapter is incredibly hopeful, and it's hard to see that with just an initial reading, but I think it's a good chapter. It's an important chapter. And it's an important chapter it's important to remember what we've been reading. This chapter is the seventh seal and the first four trumpets. The 7 trumpet blasts accompany the opening of the seventh seal. And remember, we have to go all the way back. Remember the scroll that was given to John. And John could not open the scroll, and so he wept. Who can open the scroll? Only the one who, only the Lamb. Only Christ can open the scroll. And so chapter 6, we read about the first 6 seals, you remember. And what happened upon the opening of the 6th seal in chapter 6?
Silence.
Well, that's with the 7th seal. In chapter 6, we read about the opening of the 6th seal. And with that, that's when there were these cosmic implications. So there was this natural disaster accompanied with the opening of the 6th seal. Then, you remember in chapter 7, we had the interlude. We had the interruption. It was if you remember, we showed the clip from the Princess Bride when the boy is a little concerned that Princess Buttercup is going to get eaten, and the grandfather interrupts the story and says, she doesn't get eaten by the eel. It's okay. Chapter 7 was saying, in the midst of all this destruction, it's going to be okay. And now we come to the 7th seal, and it's a continuation. We're going back to the devastation that we've been reading about in chapter 6, but there's an important lens through which we have to read it. So anyway, that's just kind of bringing us back to where we are. But when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Why silence?
There was a continuation of praising God, so they had ceased praising God.
Yeah, I mean, evidently they had ceased what they had been doing. All those who had been singing and praising have now stopped. Why is there this silence? Reverence? Yeah. Some people have talked about how it could be a dramatic effect. If you think about a play or a movie or a song, sometimes there's a brief silence before it all comes crashing in again. And this is a bit of a it's a theatrical text. It's very dramatic. It's very over-the-top, grandiose. So part of it is maybe there's a bit of drama in that, catching the reader's attention.
It shows us that sometimes we have a lot going on and there's a lot of things going on around, but we just need to be silent.
Right. Silence is an incredibly important part of our Christian life. And here, all of heaven and all of earth waits with bated breath.
But they could be reflecting on what they had just heard and being thankful for what they heard.
From chapter 7, the silence could be, they're thankful that there's not complete destruction from chapter 7, that there's hope.
Chapter 7, right, never again.
Right.
Say, okay, great hope, we're thankful. They could be praising that.
Right. Well, and I think the way in which we interpret this silence is this is way different than what we've been reading in the book. This is, I mean, what we've been reading up to this point is just loud and big and cacophony and chaos. But then, when the 7th seal is open, what's going to happen once the 7th seal is taken off?
They can open the scroll.
You can read the scroll. They're ready to read the scroll. John, the heavenly host, and John, they're looking forward to the contents of the scroll, because what is in the scroll? The revelation. Remember, we've not yet gotten to the revelation. Once that 7th seal is broken, then they can read the scroll. Then the revelation is going to be read. So they're excited. There's this silence, in this hush, and what's coming.
Would it be like, things going on and you use the word but?
Right.
A pause.
There's a pause. And then the story continues. And how long was the silence? About half an hour. About half an hour. Roughly half an hour. It's an interesting interval. I don't think we should read too much into it. I think basically this is just a short period of time. For a brief moment, there's silence. This would not be an exact length of time. I mean, it says about 30 minutes. So we don't read too much into that, but But for about half an hour, for a little bit, there was silence. I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Interestingly, the angels are not the active agents here. Does it say the angels took the trumpets? It says they received the trumpets. They were given to them. God is the acting agent in this whole thing. And why are they given trumpets? Trumpets, in antiquity, trumpets were not necessarily musical instruments. They weren't used to make pretty music like we would think of trumpets today. They were given to make announcements, to get the attention of an assembly or an army. If a king was going to make a decree, you would blow the trumpets so that everybody knew something important is going to happen. The blowing of the trumpets would precede scripturally, and within this genre, apocalyptic literature, they would precede theophanies. If there's going to be a revelation of God, it would likely be preceded by the blowing of trumpets. And do you know what that means then? You know what all of this means? This means that we're still not to the actual revelation. This whole chapter, what we're talking about, the blowing of the 7 trumpets, the fact that we've got to hear what happens with the blowing of the 7 trumpets means we still have to wait. We're still not getting to the contents of the scroll. We're not going to get to the contents of the scroll until all of the trumpets have blown. God still has not fully revealed himself. That will come at the 7th trumpet. But what we know is that it's coming. We're going to see the revelation, and soon, but not yet. So we wait with bated breath. What's coming? Another angel with a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given a great quantity of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar that is before the throne. Before the trumpets are blown, however, it just seems like the story keeps getting interrupted, doesn't it? There's one interruption after another. Can't we get to what's going on? But it's so important. Before the trumpets are blown, there's another angel. The censer carries with it and within it the prayers of the saints. Just to recap, who are the saints? Are they those who have died? Are they the extra holy ones? Well, yes, but it's the faithful. It's those who are faithful. The saints are just all of the faithful. That was a way to describe who the faithful ones were. And it carried the prayers before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. This is a good word for the faithful. This tells them God hears our prayers. The prayers rise up before God. God knows what you are asking. God knows how you are communicating. This is a good thing. Our prayers rise before God. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. What? Why would the censer that carries the prayers of the saints to the altar, to the throne of God, why would that be thrown with fire from the altar onto the earth? This is a strange thing, but that's not new. The book of Revelation is filled with these strange things. I think one of the things this indicates is that the relationship between heaven and earth is not so distant. Throughout the book of Revelation, we see that what happens on earth has heavenly implications. What happens in heaven has earthly implications. There's this relationship between the heavenly reality and the earthly reality. They mirror each other, and they're in relationship with one another. What we can also read this as is that the prayers of the faithful, the prayers of the saints, have been answered. That God will not let the earth succumb to the devastation we've been reading about. Remember, the saints have said, "How long, Lord, until you vindicate? How long until you fix all of this?" So this could be the prayers of the saints being answered. In this chapter, I think, is deliverance. This is what we're reading about. This is an important chapter because this is describing deliverance. And when we get through the next verses, the imagery will speak to deliverance. God will intervene. And in his judgment, despite what it seems like we're reading, God is going to save the earth. What we read about this in this chapter is God saving the earth, interestingly enough. This saving judgment is accompanied by the same cosmic phenomena as what has emanated from the throne. You remember what we read about what emanated from the throne, right? Thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning. We've heard this before, earlier in the book, only this time it's also accompanied by an earthquake. So I think this is deliverance. So yes, let's just keep moving. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets made ready to blow them. Before we see what happens when the trumpets are blown, I think this is really fun, but I also think it's important that we look at the literary structure of this chapter, beginning at verse 7. There's a specific structure that happens in chapters 8, 9, and 10 that mirrors a structure we've already seen. In chapter 6, we read about the breaking of the seals on the scroll. There was a pattern to that. When the seals were broken, the first 4 seals were all related, the 4 horsemen. We had the first 4 seals, and then there was the 5th seal, and then there was the 6th seal, and then we had an interlude in chapter 7, the 144,000 and the multitude. There was a hold on a second. Before we get to the 7th seal, there was a pause. And then we just read that the 7th seal is being opened. Accompanying the opening of the 7th seal are the 7 trumpets. And what we're going to read in this chapter are the first 4 trumpets. We had the first 4 seals that were all connected to each other. Now we've got the first 4 trumpets. These are all connected to each other. Then we'll read about the 5th trumpet. Then we'll read about the 6th trumpet. And then we're going to have another break. There's going to be another pause before the 7th trumpet is blown. It's going to have the same pattern. It's this recapitulation. The pattern is being brought up again. First 4, then the 5th, then the 6th, pause, then the 7th. And so this chapter, with the breaking of the 7th seal, cinematography is a great metaphor for us. With the breaking of the 7th seal, it's like we zoom in now. We zoom in and we have these 7 trumpets that accompany the breaking of the 7th seal. And we won't see, until the 7th trumpet is blown in chapter 11, we won't see the revelation. So this is all just building and building and building until we get to the contents. So in verse 7, the first angel blew his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were hurled to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. This sounds fun, doesn't it? This is good news, right? Does it sound familiar? Does this sound like anything else? Not in the book of Revelation, but within our scripture? Where hail was hurled to the earth, where trees were demolished by the hail, where fields were demolished by the hail. Exodus, the plagues in Egypt. This mirrors the plagues that accompanied the deliverance of the slaves from Egypt. Exodus chapter 9. This mirrors the plague of the hail, only in apocalyptic fashion. I mean, if you thought that was hail, well, we've got hail with fire mixed with blood. I mean, this is a plague taken to the nth degree. Because in an apocalypse, things get taken and blown way out of proportion. This is a caricature. So this sounds pretty devastating, doesn't it? Interestingly enough, this is good news. Would you believe me if I told you this was good news? This is good news. Here's why. How much destruction is there?
Third, yeah.
Was the whole earth consumed?
No.
Were all the trees destroyed? No, only 1/3. Look at your cheat sheet. What does 1/3 represent? A limited scope. This is a limited devastation. I mean, it might be devastating, but when you consider the contents of chapter 6, when you consider the destruction that we read about in chapter 6 and all the chaos that accompanies the wrath of God, remember, the wrath of God is God letting people live into the reality that they have chosen. You want to live in chaos? Well, it's not going to be fun, but that's what it's going to be. That's what you want. Well, that's what you're choosing. That's what it's going to be. That's the wrath of God. When you consider that, it's kind of miraculous that everything isn't destroyed. Only 1/3. Only 1/3 is destroyed. Not everything. With the hail, there's a limited scope to the damage that this can do. And then this pattern will continue. In verse 8, the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. 1/3 of the sea became blood. 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. Does this sound familiar? 1/3 of the sea became blood. Another plague. Remember, the Nile River turned to blood. Exodus chapter 7. Once again, this is an Egyptian plague being described with at apocalyptic proportions, taken to just over-the-top extremes. This is over-the-top language. And then 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died. 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. Is this total devastation? No. Remember, we are describing the climax of evil empire. That's what we've been reading about in chapter 6 before we had the interlude. Chaos is just running rampant. But all is not lost. There may be devastation, but it's a limited devastation. It's not going to consume the entire sea, despite the fact that there is something like a great mountain burning with fire being thrown into the sea. The whole sea is not consumed. The whole sea is not turned to blood. Not all ships will be destroyed. It's a limited thing. And then verse 10, the third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. Here we deviate slightly from the Exodus plagues. Some have drawn a connection to the water turning to blood because the water was not potable. Obviously, the Nile River in Egypt would not have been potable water if it was blood. So some might saying this is just the further extension of that because the water has turned to wormwood, which would have been considered poisonous or not potable. But this is different. It's not turned to blood. We've already had it turn to blood. This kind of deviates, but it's an apocalyptic plague. And it's going to show up again. The name of the star is Wormwood. We don't know anything about this because we're good Nazarenes. But do you know what the active ingredient in the drink absinthe is? It's called wormwood. It's a plant. The Greek word for wormwood is absinthe. That's the word for wormwood. If you read Revelation in the Greek, it says that the name of the star is absinthe. And so absinthe, which is a hallucinogenic alcoholic beverage, it's made from the wormwood plant. So they're saying that the name of the star is Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters became wormwood. 1/3 of the waters became absinthe. Became something that is not life-sustaining. Many people died because they were drinking this wormwood, this absinthe. And And so the water is not potable. Were all the waters contaminated? How much of the waters were contaminated? Again, what does that mean? Not everything. This is not complete destruction. Is this devastating? Sure. That's what happens when you choose contrary to God. This is what unfaithfulness leads to. But is it complete devastation? No. Why not? And that's the question. And I want to pause on that answer. And many died from the water because it was made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light was darkened, a third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. So the fourth trumpet. Here, what does this sound like? Darkness. From what? From one of the Egyptian plagues again. John is just taking, he's a plagiarist, isn't he? If he couldn't get this published today without a litany of footnotes. He's taking so much from the Jewish scriptures. He's taking so much from the Old Testament. And here we see an Egyptian plague, darkness. If you remember the plague in Egypt, though, there was utter darkness, complete darkness. Is this complete darkness? Is the sun, is the moon, are the stars blacked out fully? No, just turn the dial down a little bit. Turn the dial down by 33%. A third of the sun, a third of the stars, a third of the moon was kept from shining its light. This is limited darkness. This isn't complete and utter distance from anything light. A third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. What does 1/3 mean? Limited. And I know we're moving right along, but the pattern is here. I mean, you read this, and when you know what's happening, it starts to fill in. Oh, a third of this, a third of that. I mean, that's everywhere. Then in verse 13, then I looked, and I heard an eagle cry with a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth at the blasts of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. Interestingly, does John see the eagle? He heard, but it's the language is so interesting because there are times when John says, I heard this thing and then I looked. Now John says, then I looked and I heard. I mean, presumably John would have seen it, but is describing what he hears. Heard an eagle crying in a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven. What is mid-heaven? High in the sky. Maybe saw the eagle up high. Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, because we have a different cosmology. We have a different understanding of the relationship between where heaven is and where earth is. Perhaps this would have been like a space between heaven and earth, flying in the midst of both heaven and earth. And this is a warning to all in both heaven and on the earth. Spoiler alert, people are not going to heed the warning of the eagle. Spoiler alert, in the next few chapters we're going to see that they're not going to heed this warning, but the warning is given nonetheless. This eagle who flies above everyone, right? When you're driving down the road and you see an eagle in the sky, I mean, it's hard not to look up. It's hard not to see that. This is something visible. You can't miss it. Why an eagle flying? Because this is something that all people are to hear. All people are to heed this word. Yes, Frida.
Yeah, mine always says angel. So an angel is an eagle. 7 angels. The first angel, the second angel.
Yes, the trumpets are being blown by angels. But in verse 13, there was an eagle crying with a loud voice.
Oh, and mine says angel.
In verse 13?
Yes.
Oh, does the
I looked and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven.
so that you have does the NIV says an angel?
No, it's King James Version.
Oh, the King James version says an angel?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And so I wondered why.
I did not see that. Interesting. I mean, when I pull up the Greek, it is not the same word as angel in the original language. The original language has a different Greek word than messenger. Euangelion would be that word. This one is atos, which is an eagle. So that's interesting. I did not know that another translation had angel there.
Mine says angel all through.
Yes, and in the other verses, it would have, I mean, it's all angel throughout the chapter, except for verse 13, it changes. In the original language, at least, it changes to atos, which was an eagle. Interesting, I didn't know that. NIV says eagle? Okay. Okay. What we read tonight was the New Revised Standard, NRSV, which also says eagle. I think I would stick with the eagle, with the original language, which that's a different vision than the angels, because this is something that would have been visible, that would have been able to be seen by all, and so all would have been able to heed the warning. All would have heard it as it flies through mid-heaven.
Well, you think of angels flying through heaven.
Right, right. So what does this eagle say? Whoa, whoa, whoa. To the inhabitants of the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. What is he saying? Basically, this angel is saying, you ain't seen nothing yet. Woe to you at the blowing of the next ones. You think this is something. Well, just wait. So once again, the tension builds. The drama keeps escalating, right? This is what we're seeing. In eight chapters, we're going to see a similar pattern. In chapter 16, when we look, we're going to see some very similar things happen. That we're gonna read about the 7 bowls. We're going to see this similar pattern. It's almost like we're being told the story again in a slightly different way. So remember this pattern. Remember this imagery, because we're going to revisit it again. John will tell this again. He really wants his readers to understand this. And as we discussed, we're tempted to read this chapter and feel a bit hopeless. When you read this chapter, it's scary. A third of the trees, a third of the water, a third of the sea. I mean, this sounds bad, right? But I think this is good news, because we've been reading about complete unfaithfulness. We've been reading about utter chaos. But this chapter is included to let the church know that no matter how bad things look, no matter how chaotic this whole world might be, no matter how far off everything gets, God is not going to let evil and chaos and death reign supreme. We've been reading about this utter chaos, and when we read about the seventh seal being opened up, it's a limited thing. We would expect that it would just be like everything is gone. And typically, when we think about Revelation, what comes to our mind is the destruction of the earth. That's a very popular way of reading this whole narrative. We think about the earth being destroyed. But that's not what we read. It's only a third. This is the grace of God. In the midst of utter chaos that we have brought upon ourselves, God says, I'm not going to let everything get destroyed. Death and chaos may do its worst, but it can only damage 1/3 of creation. Not even half. Death and destruction and chaos can only do 1/3 of damage. It will not derail God's good creation. Not completely. God will not let that happen. I think we're reading about the grace of God, who is intervening in the midst of our chaos and saying, you will not take this. This is the promise of God's deliverance. Remember in chapter 7, we read that this was God saying to the faithful, she doesn't get eaten by the eel. And the Princess Bride saying, it's okay. All's not lost. And here we have that similar theme. In many ways, this chapter echoes the Exodus story, right? The plagues, which led to what? What did the plagues lead to? Deliverance for the slaves. That's the imagery we're reading about in this chapter. This chapter is deliverance. While this world might be going crazy, God is not going to let it all get destroyed. The faithful, the saints, will have deliverance. Chapter 8 is God's deliverance. As empire grows and as unfaithfulness abounds, which is what we've been reading about in the last few chapters, as people choose other than God, what we see here tonight is that God will be faithful to deliver. And God will stop the chaos from taking over. God will stop the destruction. Not at the end. God will stop it at 1/3.
Is that 1/3 going to be all in the same area, or is it going to be a third here and maybe a third over here?
Well, I think it's important to see this as symbolic language. I think what we see here is that throughout history, we've seen what we read in chapter 6. We've seen that happen as people have chosen other than God. We've seen chaos start to rear its ugly head throughout different eras within history. But in the midst of all of that, God is saying there will not be utter devastation here. I will not let it get to the final devastation. So I think this isn't necessarily chronicling future events. I don't think this is saying that these specific events are happening in the future. This is saying, listen, when you choose other than God, when people pledge their lives to something other than the kingdom of God, it necessarily escalates into something chaotic. And this is what happens. This is what happens. But God will not let the faithful be wiped out. God will not let devastation have its way. And so I think that's what we're reading. We see this happen through the Roman Empire. We see this happen throughout other empires within human history. And so I don't know that these are predicted events. These are the realities that happen when people choose contrary to God. This is the natural end of unfaithfulness. But the promise is God is stepping in. So that's a kind of different answer to that question. But yeah, so this is our lesson for tonight. Chapter 8 is an interesting chapter, looking at God's mitigating devastation, God preventing it from taking over completely. Any final thoughts before we close for the night? And I told you it might be a little bit shorter, and I mean, I can keep talking about this stuff forever. I love this, but I don't want to force it. I mean, this is our lesson. If there's anything else, let's talk about it. Otherwise, we can be dismissed, but let's keep chatting.
Is there any way that, is, in a sense, going on today, we see right now in the United States,